Alright, so need to check for damage, see if the head is blown. First I wanted to check around on the sprocket teeth here, make sure that the sprocket teeth are not damaged. What we've got to do is make a compression test without the chain on. So this cam, the intake cam, is not going to be turning, whereas the exhaust cam will be turning off the tooth belt, timing belt. So what we have to do is make sure that the intake cam is in a non-interference position, which is one reason why I took off the cover, but actually you don't really have to take the cover off to do this, but so I have an adjuster tool here, homemade. It goes into the slot, the triple lobe cam for the high pressure fuel pump. Now this motor turns in a clockwise direction when you're on the passenger side, so everything's turning clockwise. So over here I would be pulling this towards me. Now when I pull it towards me slightly, you can see there's a little back pressure. You don't want to go too far, just a little bit. So there's the back pressure, and likewise you can also push it backwards slightly the other way. It's not going to hurt it to go backwards a little bit either. So what you got is basically a neutral position where none of the cams on the shaft are pushing the valves down into an interference position, so that your intake cam is basically in a neutral position. Therefore, once I put the covers back on, put the tester in each plug hole, then I can check the compression, do a cold compression check. So I've prepped for the compression test. The intake cylinder is not hooked up to the chain, intake cam that is. The exhaust cam is hooked up through the belt. The high pressure fuel pump has been disconnected. So that is no longer a problem. The battery has been tightened on with pliers, which is not adequate for ordinary use, but that'll do for now. You have to put the key in the ignition, just part way in, not all the way in, to keep the alarm from going off when you reinsert the battery. So the compression tester is hooked up where I can see it through the windshield, more or less. And then I'll just go through cylinders 1 through 4, 3, 4 cranks or whatever, until the needle reaches the maximum point on the gauge, and then assuming that it goes anywhere, so we'll find out if the motor's blown. Okay, so I did the compression check. I got compression only 4 bars because it's a cold compression check. So I got 4 bars on cylinder 1 and 2. 1 is on the passenger side. I didn't get compression on 3 and 4. So I took the covers back off. I rotated the intake cam. I rotated that 2 clicks this way. So now I have these lobes are nowhere near the roller lifters, and these two over here are near the roller lifters, so they might have been putting a little bit of pressure on them, so I figured I'd better just go ahead and do that last check and make sure that that I'm actually not getting compression in 3 and 4. I thought it was suspicious because 3 and 4 are right beside each other, and I remembered that the cams on both of these were right on the rollers themselves. So I thought, maybe that they're just open just a touch. The valves are open just a touch. So I went ahead and popped the cap back off, and so the triple lobe is therefore again in the vertical position. So if it's in the vertical position in one direction, and then again you rotate it twice and it's in the vertical position the second time, then you're good. You're covering both halves. So once again, you won't have to take the valve cover off in order to do this complete compression check. Yeah, I forgot to mention when I had the cover off that when you're advancing the intake crank by hand, you'll need to you'll need to advance the crank as well, because you're likely to come up against the pistons with the valves when you're moving it by hand, so you're going to have to move the pistons too. So this is how I do that. 19 millimeter, a little bit of a cheater extension on there. And the nice thing is that this goes right on down from the top, and you can hook it right in to the main crank bolt right there like that. So then you're set to advance it clockwise, and then as you move it a click at a time, you'll be able to feel it move here, and then once it gets up past the crest, then you can advance your intake cam until you get it so that your slot's in the vertical position again. Okay, I just completed the cold compression check in 2 stages. I did cylinders 1 and 2 first. I advanced the triple lobe on the intake cam 2 places, so the slot went from vertical to vertical again, and then I did the compression check on the next 2 cylinders, and I got compression on all 4. Praise God. Yeah, the cold compression check ranged between 2 and 6 bar, and that's with the engine having been more or less sitting for about a week. So with cold compression, you're not going to get the actual reading that you want, which is you want 7 bar at least. Ordinarily that's what the book says, but the book is not always quite so honest, and so we like to believe it, but you can't really. So it's more of an art form, working on a Volkswagen, at least this Volkswagen. So try not to take too much artistic license, and think it through the best you can. Okay, a few tips here when you're putting the oil seals on the camshaft adjuster cover. This is an old one. There's 3 of them, 1, 2, 3. They're very fragile, so if you want to save the old ones, you spiral them off. Use mechanic picks. These work rather nicely. Without them, it's very difficult. So they would spiral. You do the top one, comes off first, next one comes off next, the bottom one comes off, and reverse order. So you don't jump over them, you don't leapfrog them when you're putting them on, especially. You just have to be very delicate with them, and they will go on and off. So that's that. The power booster, you can see right there, this vacuum line is brittle, and it had a leak underneath it where it connected up. That was kind of a pretty serious problem, and it was not at all apparent. But I finally figured that out, and the fact that the line is brittle is problematic. So that line goes right to here, and then it goes underneath the camshaft adjuster cover, and it runs up against, you can see how it's pushed in right there, it runs up against a coolant line, which is hot, and that line is actually partially collapsed, and it's brittle material, so it doesn't bounce back at all. So that line needs to be replaced. I went ahead and replaced this brake booster hose. So that's done. I put a nice actual vacuum line, rubber reinforced with a weave in there, and instead of this brittle plastic, which is clearly no good, it says Germany right on it. And this was the end that was underneath the brake booster, so that split there was a pretty substantial vacuum leak. It was enough so that the turbo was coming on a little bit late. You could actually feel the bump where the turbo would come on, whereas having patched that leak, the turbo, it's unnoticeable. It comes on, it's smooth, it's just one nice smooth acceleration. So anyhow, that hose has been replaced with decent quality hose, and this will go on the scrap heap. You have to be careful about that fitting. That is kind of a tough one, so I had to cut that off on that end. This kind of fitting is probably what was on the underside of that. Now there's a line that runs underneath there that's bolted to the engine, and then you have another fitting like this that goes into that line down here. So this is the other end, apparently the other end of the master cylinder power booster, which tees in to here to the vacuum pump. So this is maybe a little bit easier because this unplugs the same as what this one does, the same fitting there. So you can pull that out. You see how that's just about gone, and it's half-inch fuel hose is apparently what works, because the vacuum line that the store offered, none of it was big enough, so for some reason they're using a large line here. Down here, the new vacuum hose I put in, we're going to need to keep that up off the coolant hose, so let's get a zip tie on that. And we'll keep that right together there, so that's good and sturdy.